Instead of more symmetry, useless discussion.
There's a certain kind of form of confidence.
Hey,
How are you?
good. I heard good reports about.
I think your seminar is very well attended.
Oh no, our
my
reputation
spies.
precedes us.
I have my spies.
Yeah, it was a very nice conference. I think you would have liked it.
I think so.
Yeah.
But all things you might expect it to be.
This is actually said here.
It's also a good thing, interesting at least.
Followers
Yeah.
of Stanley Mitchell. Everyone was like, "Oh my God, this is the truth."
All right, let's get started. Thanks for coming today. Before introducing our speaker, let me remind you of the events in the coming days. On Tuesday, we have a lunchtime talk given by Karl Hofer, who is with us, a senior visiting fellow this year, who will be talking about generalization in complex mind-dependent systems. It's at noon here on Tuesday. And on Friday, there is no lunchtime talk, but there is the second lecture of the annual lecture series at 3:30 on the 10th floor, given by Colin Clive from the Australian National University on transformers, representational structure, and the language of thought. If you're interested in Colin's work, on Thursday at 2 p.m., we will have a reading group of some of his papers, and so get back to me if you're interested and share the paper with you. That's it for the announcement. Today, it's my pleasure to introduce Tushar Menon, who is a visiting fellow at the center this semester. So Tushar was, and I'm not sure whether he still is, an assistant professor at the Australian Catholic University of the ill-fated Dinoya University. So don't talk to him about kangaroos. Talk to him about anything Australia related. Tushar is a philosopher of physics. He did his work in theoretical physics at King's in London, and then his work in philosophy of physics at Oxford. He also did work in creative writing also at King's when he was at the same time was doing his physics. He worked in the philosophy of physics on many topics: symmetry, supersymmetry, relativity, and quantum mechanics. But he has much broader interest in philosophy broadly understood, including Bob Random, which is an interesting combination. He has published widely in philosophy of science, in foundations of physics, in studies, in VGPS, in philosophy of science in recent years on all of these topics, including combining philosophy of physics and random, and a paper in the VGPS, actually. So, but today, Tushar will be talking about scientific realism as a normative notion. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Edward. That was a really, really kind introduction. Thank you all for coming. It's really lovely to see you. As Edward mentioned, I have a background in physics, and then my background in philosophy is via philosophy of physics in Oxford. And one of the things, sorry, I'm sure David can attest to this, one of the things that is kind of in the air in philosophy of physics in Oxford is these physicists, they're all right. They're pretty good. We should kind of take them seriously, right? You know, if you find yourself sort of trying to be wildly revisionary about what's going on with, what's really going on with physics, I don't know, maybe you should take a step back. And that's kind of the origins of my sort of desire to be a scientific realist, right? I kind of want to be a scientific realist. And well, one of the things that has sort of led me down this inferentialist direction that I'm going to be talking about today is the view that the standard ways in which we actually make sense of scientific realism, I think they could use a bit of an update, right? I don't want to suggest that I'm redefining anything, but I'm just I'm just polishing things up a little bit. So I seem not to be able to. Okay, great. Right. So as always, I just like to start off with a take-home message in case people need to leave or get bored. So what I'm going to argue for today is the idea that in order to understand what it is to be a scientific realist and also an anti-realist, we need to understand the norms that govern the descriptive deployment of vocabulary. Descriptive deployment is a bit of a term of art. I'll say a bit more about that later. And this is the sense in which you've got the two senses of normative from the title. The first is just understand, understand the circumstances under which descriptive deployment of vocabulary is good or licit or thumbs uppy. But then also descriptive deployment itself is to be understood, in normative terms. And I think it is important to point out that this also applies to the anti-realist in senses that I will highlight, because I think there's something of a anti-realist is something of a pejorative term, at least in science, as I understand it. And I kind of want to stand up for the anti-realists a little bit, right? Anyway, in ways that will hopefully become clear as we progress. Right. So here's the view of scientific realism that I want to propose. You might call this subsection of scientific realism semantic realism, but anyway, what I want to suggest is that scientific realism with respect to some vocabulary, some scientific theoretical vocabulary, is just the view that the descriptive deployment of that vocabulary is rendered normatively licit by the role that such a deployment plays in achieving the local goal of that scientific theory. So I'll have more to say about, as I said, descriptive deployment, but also local goal. And mutatis mutandis anti-realism. Depending on how you mute the mutes, you'll get a more or less strong version of scientific anti-realism. So you might just deny, you might say that the non-descriptive deployment is rendered normatively licit. That's a stronger vision, a stronger version and vision. Or you might say that, or you might sort of try to be agnostic and just say the descriptive deployment is not rendered normatively licit. Either way, you're a particular kind of scientific anti-realist. How does this compare to just the standard statement of scientific realism that we're all used to in the post sort of Silos, Ladyman, Chakravarti textbook world? Well, scientific realism is generally taken to have three components. There's a metaphysical, and a semantic, and an epistemic. And each of them has kind of two components that I want to highlight. One of them is a sort of tethering thesis, right? You divide the stuff that you're interested in. In the metaphysical case, it's stuff in the world. In the semantic case, it's stuff in our language or in our theories. You divide those broadly into two, and you say there's something in common between those two. So on the metaphysical side of things, there's some metaphysical characterization we give to things that we're okay with, chairs, tables, observables. And we say, well, to be a metaphysical realist about unobservables in such a way as to underpin a kind of scientific realism is to think that the other stuff also has the same metaphysical status, right? And so the stuff that we're comfortable with is what sets the standards for the metaphysical status, right? That's what the additional claim is. Similarly with the semantic and similarly with the epistemic, right? With the semantic, we say we treat theoretical terms in the same way as we treat observational terms. And the epistemic is to say, sometimes we have knowledge of observables. A similar honorific can be bestowed on claims about unobservables. It's knowledge proper. It's not something else. What I want to focus on today are the semantic and epistemic components, because I think those are importantly methodologically prior to the metaphysical component. And these are the two aspects that I would like to argue should be thought of normatively. So in order to understand why, or rather to prime you for the normative claim, I want to look at two places where truthiness or something truthy quite often enters the discussion, and that will roughly correspond to the semantic and epistemic side of things. So one is at the level of what you might call content conferral onto claims, right? This is generally associated with people like Donald Davidson, more recently people like Kit Fine. And the idea is pretty, well, not plausible to me, but sort of prima facie plausible, which is to understand the content of a particular sort of claim is to understand the conditions under which that claim will be true. If I know the truth conditions, I know what those claims are. But there's a separate place where something truthy, correspondency sometimes comes up. And this is far more common, right? This is virtually everyone, I think, who's not a pragmatist. Even pragmatists sort of have a way of making sense of this, as do I. And that's sort of at the level of the vindication of claims. I know what my models say, what my sentences say. And then if it turns out that the world is that way, there's some kind of correspondence, I get vindication through something truthy. And so to bring this back to scientific realism, you can think of truth as playing an important role in content conferral. You can think of truth as playing an important role in vindication, right? And I think the standard way of thinking about scientific realism is that it's alethetic on at least one of these fronts and often both. So a kind of strong standard scientific realism is doubly alethic. A slightly weaker standard scientific realism might be alethic with respect to the epistemic, but not necessarily semantic or vice versa, and be kind of agnostic with respect to the other. What I want to suggest is both of these ought to be thought of on normative grounds. And I want to invoke a bunch of work that's been done by people in this building over many years on both sides of the with respect to both aspects. On the content conferral side, I'm going to be invoking work by people like Sellars-Brandom, stuff that Hugh Price has also invoked, talking about the normative aspect of content conferral. And I think that's pretty well established in the pragmatist philosophy of language literature. But also on the other side of things, the evaluative side of things, the vindication side of things, I think that's pretty well established also in the pragmatist literature, a bit more in the pragmatist HPS literature of people, these are all Pittsburgh people as it happens, at some point or the other. And so two things that I want to clarify. The first is I don't want to suggest that people on this side are unaware of what's been going on on the other side, or vice versa. What I want to suggest is there are two conceptually interesting and distinct things going on. A lot of people involved in both sides of things are involved in both sides, in each side of things, are involved in both sides of things, but I just want to highlight the relationship between them. Good. So much by way of broad setup. The way that I'm going to hopefully convince you that I'm entirely right about everything forever is in three sections. I'm going to introduce you to Bob Brandom's analytic pragmatism sort of framework for understanding, for approaching pragmatism in what I take to be quite a helpful way. And then I'll spend a little time, this is sort of the meat of the talk, I'll spend a little time talking separately about the two kinds of norms, the two kinds of normativity. Great, so let's talk about analytic pragmatism. It sounds like a contradiction in terms, it's not. And what I'm going to do in this section is talk first about the analytic side of things, and then about the pragmatism side of things. The broad idea being, at least as people like Brandon think about it, there's a particular core analytic project. The project itself is along the right lines, but the manner in which certain groups of people have gone about it could possibly use a bit of an update, and that update will come from the pragmatist lines of thought. So one sort of caricature, cartoony way, but I think still sort of roughly useful way of thinking about the core project of analytic philosophy in the 20th century is as understanding the relationships between vocabularies, right? If you want something concrete in mind, think of people like the logical empiricists, but this goes beyond them as well. And the idea there is we've got two kinds of vocabulary, what you might call an okay vocabulary and what you might call a troublesome vocabulary. For the logical empiricists, this might be a phenomenal vocabulary or an empirical vocabulary or something like that. And that could be a vocabulary that includes moral claims, modal claims, or claims about unobservables. And the goal of philosophy, as it were, at least the goal of philosophy understood in such a way that philosophy of language is first philosophy, right, to use a Dometianism, is to just figure out what kind of semantic relations or maybe logical relations allow you to express the appropriate relation between these two types of vocabulary in such a way that the troublesome vocabulary is not troublesome anymore, right? So if I can, for example, define away the troublesome vocabulary, or if I can ramsify away the troublesome vocabulary, or something like that, then I've achieved the goal of the sort of core analytic project. And of course, there are various reasons that this didn't quite work out. So one way of dealing with the situation is just to blow it all up and say, look, this stuff about languages is nonsense. We should be talking about metaphysics. We should be talking about epistemology first. I think, say what you will about the logical empiricists, I think methodologically they're onto something by foregrounding semantics. And so this is where the pragmatism comes in to kind of patch things up. So on this Brandomian view, one way to think about what's going on with what pragmatism is in these terms, right? Our assessment of the content of claims is inseparable from, and in some sense exhausted by the impact that those claims have on our agency within the world. I should say this is not the only characterization. Later on, we will see that the assessment, not just of the content, it occurs to me that that assessment is doing 2 bits of work over here, both of which I will invoke. So our understanding of the content is inseparable from our agency within the world, but also our evaluation of what that content is inseparable. And so pragmatism kind of incorporates both. In this section, I'm only interested in the content of claims, right? Broadly speaking, people who are interested in the content of claims talk about things like meanings. And broadly speaking, people who are interested in things like discursive agency within the world talk about pragmatics, right? The study of the use of language. And so understood in this sense, pragmatism is just a tethering thesis, right? It's just the claim that there are no meaning conferral facts that are not pragmatic facts. Given that, spoiler, what the hell? Given that, what Brandom suggests is the following. We don't need to be looking for direct relations between these kinds of vocabulary, but we should still be looking for a relation between the vocabularies. But the way that we do that is we understand one of them as a kind of vocabulary, a sort of meta-vocabulary for the other, with a specific role of telling us what it is that we need to do or be able to do in order to successfully use or deploy those bits of vocabulary. Right? A simple example of this might be, you might think that there's something kind of fishy about intentional vocabulary, but not about extensional vocabulary, because I can just point to stuff. And at least on one way of thinking about what's going on with something like possible world semantics, where we're kind of understanding intension in terms of functions and extensions, really what we're doing is we're using an OK vocabulary and an extensional vocabulary of specifying what it is that we need to do, namely define intentions in terms of functions, from possible worlds to extensions, in order to deploy our troublesome vocabulary. And what I want to suggest is this is a good way of thinking about how we should think about the semantic component of scientific realism, right? Because then, understood in these terms, we can understand the basic question that the semantic realist asks in the following terms. Do claims made in the troublesome vocabulary become meaningful in the same way as claims made in the non-troublesome vocabulary, right? Giving this a pragmatist gloss, you can ask the question, do claims involving this troublesome vocabulary facilitate the development of our plans, big picture stuff, to navigate the world in the same way as claims involving O vocabulary? And what I want to suggest is this is a good way to think about the semantic component of realism. It does give you the sort of truthy, correspondency, referencey type thing in certain circumstances, but it's not tethered to that, right? And the way to see that is if we look at a standard, got a bit ahead of myself. So what I want to do is, actually I didn't get ahead of myself, I just already said that. What I want to suggest is the manner in which we should think about semantic realism on these terms, on these analytic pragmatic terms, is in terms of what renders licit a descriptive deployment of particular kinds of vocabulary, whether observational or theoretical. I should say, and I will say in what follows, a little bit more about vector navigating. For now, I'm just going to let that be sort of box X that I will fill in later. What I want to suggest is there are various ways in which you could fill it in, and that will give rise to sort of interesting and appropriate things to say about descriptive deployment. So you might think it's just straightforwardly making better predictions, right? Just going out to my favorite quantum bookie and making bets about the outcomes of quantum experiments. I don't know if David's ever done that, but I certainly have. But anyway, sort of broadly speaking, you might think that's what's going on. Well, that's one way of understanding what's going on in quantum mechanics. I think you might also think about something like a sort of theory construction heuristic. I'll say more about this in a little while. Good. Why I think this is a good way of thinking about semantic realism is, well, these are the sorts of, at least tacitly, these are the sorts of arguments that go into standard semantic realism. The idea is something like the descriptive deployment of vocabulary is apt if it's being treated semantically in the same way as observational. And in fact it is, because the standard view is that semantic treatment is literal, right? Referent, theoretical terms refer, tasking model theory, something. What I want to suggest is we get rid of that, we still hold on to this, and instead replace the literal with descriptive deployment. Once we have that, we've got a nice updated semantic realism, and then the anti-realist also has something sort of straightforward to point out, saying, no, this doesn't, in this, with respect to these goals, this is not a good way to think about descriptive deployment. And so with that in mind, this is how I want to think about, this is my normative proposal for scientific realism. Well, I guess my doubly normative, but this is one aspect of it. instead of thinking as I had initially of an okay vocabulary as itself a meta vocabulary for a troublesome vocabulary, I instead want to think of all of these as a kind of sciencey, physicsy, physical vocabulary. I'm just going to take as read now that there is a meta vocabulary that we can develop for this. And if that's the case, then what I want to suggest is the semantic realist is one for whom basically the two sides of the diagram are the same, right? The way we treat the okay vocabulary is the same as the way we treat troublesome vocabulary, in particular by this notion of descriptive deployment. Good. That's the broad setup in which I want to now make some slightly more specific claims. And so now let's move on to the meat of the talk. What is it that we're doing when we are imbuing claims with descriptive content? Now, I think it's often quite hard to resist the temptation to extrapolate from paradigm cases. I mean, it's usually quite a good thing to do. And at least prima facie, the sort of paradigm use of language is descriptive, right? And the surface grammar of the languages that we speak kind of bears this out a little bit, right? The cat is black is sort of surface grammar very similar to murder is wrong. And so it's very, it's very tempting to think that what I then need to go and do is find out that, figure out what the truth makers in the world are for the claim that murder is wrong, in the same way that the cat and its properties are the truth makers for the descriptive claim about the cat. Now, of course, not everyone thinks you should do this. It's not just the pragmatists who have a problem with this. But I think the pragmatist critique of this is one that is really helpful, right? Because the critique doesn't attack this descriptivism, right? Descriptivism being the idea that to assert is to declare. It doesn't attack it directly. Instead, it notes that this view entails a bad kind of semantic atomism. And that semantic atomism is what is attacked by people like Sellars and Quine. Sellars specifically, so Quine at this point just goes, well, so then let's just jettison all this meaning nonsense, right? Deal with extension, deal with whatever. Sellars, I think, has a more appealing way of thinking about things. Because he says, look, he actually offers a positive claim about meaning, right? He says claims are rendered meaningful by in virtue of their material inferential relations to other claims. So the norms that govern those material inferential relations, that's what I'm going to be talking about in this section. So given the pragmatist kind of severing of these two kinds of deployment, what I want to do in this section is explain to you how to kind of reattach them in the circumstances where they ought to be reattached. So I will spend a little time talking about assertoric deployment, right? In other words, how do I engage in meaningful discourse on a sort of Sellars-Brandom model? And then I'll focus in on specifically the things that Brandom says about descriptive deployment. So in the broader context of the analytic pragmatism that I introduced to you in the last section, we can identify the project as one according to which we need to know what someone has to do, or maybe an ability that someone needs to have, an agent needs to have, in order to count as asserting something, right? And as I said, the Sellarsian sort of approach to this is to understand things in terms of the sorts of claims, the sorts of speech acts that can play the roles of premises and conclusions of inferences, right? The Brandomian phrase is the game of giving and asking, playing the game of giving and asking for reasons, right? That's how you sort of regiment these meanings. And I'll say actually a little bit more specifically, and I'll give you an example of how this might work. Good. Before doing that, I just want to note three things that if I don't note, might just kind of stand in the way of this seeming like a convincing way of thinking about meaning. So the first is our standard kind of introduction to model theoretic semantics kind of makes it seem like the bearers of semantic significance are things like predicates or singular terms. On this view, it's actually what I'll call claims. You can think of them as just sentences. The reason I call them claims is because I want to say stuff about physics later. It's that the sentences are the basic units of inferential or normative significance. Right? Those are the things that we have responsibility for defending if we assert. And so then to understand what's going on with the meanings of sort of sub-claim or sub-sentential components, really all we need to do is understand what those sub-sentential components are doing with respect to the sort of the inferential web in which we find these claims. The second is that when I talk about inferences, I'm talking about what are sometimes known as material inferences. So let me distinguish between formal and material inferences. Formal inferences are inferences that are treated as good in virtue of corresponding to a particular sort of, what you might call a formal schema. Right, so an example might be, Anil Kumble has more wickets. There will be a lot of cricket in this talk, by the way, incidentally. And I think that's so I didn't realize this until recently, but Sellars mentions cricket in one of his papers as well. So that's fine. That is all the justification I need, right? I'm going to be talking about deontic scorecards and scorekeeping and language games and stuff. And I want to push back against the idea that we have to do this using baseball metaphors. So as it happens, you don't really need to know anything about cricket for this talk. In order to live a good life, obviously you do need to know lots about cricket, but I'm happy to discuss that more in the Q&A session and the rest of my life. So my example of a material inference is one that I'll take from cricket. So you might say something like Anil Kumble has more test wickets than Glenn McGrath. This is indeed true. And the inference from that one ought to draw something like, and so Glenn McGrath has fewer test wickets than Anil Kumble, right? On the formalist way of thinking about that inference, really what's going on there is that it's an enthymeme, there's a hidden premise, there's a suppressed premise, and the goal should be to unsuppress the premise, and that's what's going to justify our going from one to the other. For various reasons, that's not going to be a good way to think about inference conferring meaning, in part because we kind of already need to know meanings in order for that to work. So the basic idea is we treat the first sentence that I said, something about Anil Kumble having more wickets, and the second sentence that I said, something about Glenn McGrath having fewer wickets, as an inference that's just treated as primitive or basic, given the discursive norms of the community of cricket watchers. And I was going to say cricket speakers, but even I won't go so far as to suggest that cricket is its own language. So that's and the vindication of that is going to be it's not going to be atomistic. The vindication of that is going to be via the role that treating this as a good inference plays in sort of guiding our dealings with the world. And finally, this is also kind of important. I usually skip over this, but if I do this, then I usually get a question about this. I want to suggest that what it is to endorse a claim should also be understood, should also be incorporated on this model of doings. Right? So to endorse a claim is to do something. What that something is will be understood in terms of a meta vocabulary that describes what's going on. And the reason this is important is this allows us to kind of broaden the use of the word inference to include what Sellars sometimes calls language entry and language exit transitions. So the idea is something like I'm sort of pottering about in the world. I see a snake. I go, oh my God, a snake. You're walking with me. You hear me say that, and so you kind of move out of the way, right? So the transition from me seeing a snake to me articulating the claim about the snake, that's a language entry transition. The transition from you hearing me say that to moving out of the way to doing a particular thing, that's a language exit transition. And those sorts of doings are also partly constitutive of meanings. And this is not wholly objectionable if you think that that sort of engaging in inferences as sort of on its own is also engaging in a kind of doing. So now if you think about the material inference that I introduced a minute ago, the cricket thing, the one that goes from Anil Kumble has more wickets to Glenn McGrath has fewer wickets, the endorsement of that material inference reflects a commitment to endorsing two sentences expressed in what you might call the cricket vocabulary, right? But the cricket vocabulary doesn't allow us to say what it was that we were doing when we endorse that material inference, right? For that, we need to say, we need a different vocabulary. We need one that describes what it is that we're doing when we deploy this kind of conditional reasoning, right? We need a vocabulary of conditionals, or more broadly, a vocabulary of logic. So that's the kind of meta vocabulary that would in principle go into that sort of OK box that I mentioned earlier. So using a logical meta vocabulary, we can say that we've endorsed a biconditional, right? Even though in the language in which we've actually sort of done the inference, that we don't have enough, there's not enough richness to make sense of what's going on over there. And the reason that I sort of went through this in some detail is because that kind of sort of making explicit of what's implicit in the sort of base vocabulary that you're dealing with, that's an instance of a general feature of Brandom's account that's really quite important, right? The meta vocabulary makes explicit the norms that are implicit in the deployment of sort of the first order vocabulary. And the reason that this is helpful is because that suggests to us what it is that we need to do in order to understand other kinds of doings, right? Not just material inferential kinds of doings. And so that allows us to identify what's going on in the second stage, right? In the second stage, we want to ask, well, okay, if we understand what it is that we're doing in terms of some meta vocabulary when we're engaging in conditional reasoning, we can now ask, well, what is it that we're doing when we engage in descriptive deployment of particular sorts of vocabulary? And according to Brandom, what you have to do is notice that the descriptive deployment is encoded in terms of what he calls Dirac attitude descriptions. The details of this are in making it explicit, they're in articulating reasons. I'm actually not going to go through the details of this because it's taken Brandom about 2,000 pages to get this, to express this to me. I don't have that much time here today. So what I am going to do is I'm going to try to do this using an example. There is Australia in there, so the hurt goes deeper.
I know.
In part because of the truth of that second. But anyway, so.
Just saying that second sentence helps you get around the world.
It tells you which bits of the world to avoid. Good. Okay. Oh, indeed. Excellent. So yeah. So what I want to do is I want to just present an example that hopefully pumps a few intuitions, and then, if necessary, I'll happily tighten things up in the Q&A session. I also think it keeps things a bit livelier to think about cricket. Right. So supposing we're interested in people sort of having a discussion about the recent Cricket World Cup. I mentioned this idea of a conversational scorecard, and so what I'm going to try to do is sort of explicitly construct a really simple deontic scorecard or conversational scorecard, and demonstrate how it can be used to identify the things that we're doing when we're engaged in deploying particular kinds of vocabulary. Right? So we're having a conversation. Conversation is a rule-governed activity. What makes those rules the right rules? I'll take that as kind of primitive for the purpose of this talk. There are interesting things to be said about that as well. So supposing, what do I have? Oh, no. Right. So supposing I've got two agents. Let's call them A and B. And A's opening gambit is to say India won the most recent Cricket World Cup. B, in conversation with A, says, okay, well, let me keep track of the commitments that A incurs in making that claim, right? So there's obviously an acknowledged commitment, namely that, the thing that was just asserted. But there's also an unacknowledged commitment that we should take as sort of fairly straightforward because it kind of follows from a proper understanding of what P1 is, namely that an Asian team won the most recent World Cup. This is not explicitly acknowledged by A, and so B's deontic scorecard has that as an unacknowledged commitment. But in addition to commitments, there are also, every assertion brings with it a bunch of entitlements, right? These are the analogs of permissions, right? Obligations and permissions, the shadows, commitments, and entitlements. So what B ought to be doing is actually just keeping track of the entire, I should also say if anyone could tell me how to sort of correct my LaTeX code so that goes there and that goes there, that would be the single most useful thing. Anyway. Modulo this sort of incredibly unpleasant bit of formatting. B's what I want to point out is B's deontic scorecard should also include those sets of entitlements. Those entitlements may include just a bunch of sort of random unrelated things, right? They might think that A correctly is totally entitled to the claim that Harare is the capital of Zimbabwe. But then B notices something, right? B's been having so much fun playing with these deontic scorecards. B hasn't noticed that they actually disagree with A, right? And so what they want to do is they want to issue a challenge. In particular, they want to say, no, Australia won the most recent Cricket World Cup, right? Sorry, I was distracted by the fun of all the deontic scorecard stuff. And so all I have to do as B is assert that, because it's pretty obvious that if Australia won the World Cup, then India didn't win the World Cup. And so A's deontic scorecard for B before B makes explicit this claim that follows from what they take X1 to be asserting. This is what A's deontic scorecard for B might look like, right? There's an acknowledged commitment, an acknowledged entitlement, and nothing importantly unacknowledged at this stage. But then B might, on thinking about it for a minute, realize that the reason that A, I've lost track. I should have just used Alice and Bob. So anyway, whoever is, I've lost track of it. So so A might notice that B's claim that Australia won the Cricket World Cup was actually intended as a challenge, right? Because A might suddenly realize that X2 follows from X1, and in fact X2 is the negation of P1, or at least falls in the extension of the negation of P1. And so whatever it is that's required to get X2 from unacknowledged to acknowledged, right? Either B explicitly says it, or A infers it, or something like that. What this goes to show is that the completed deontic scorecard should include both B's commitments and entitlements, as well as A's own commitments and entitlements. Because in setting things up this way, what becomes completely clear to A is that they were kind of both right, but they were both making assumptions on which they disagreed, right? And the assumption is that they were talking about the same World Cup. But if anyone knows anything about cricket, you will know that there are in fact two World Cups and a World Test Championship. So three. Anyway, and so what A realizes is that they were talking. So when they were talking about India winning the World Cup, they were talking about the T20 World Cup, and B was talking about the other World Cup, the one-day international, the 50-over World Cup, right? And once that's on the table, what's happened is that a tacit commitment that was not explicitly acknowledged gets encoded in the deontic scorecard as an explicitly acknowledged commitment, right? Once again, we see the dynamics of a meta vocabulary for talking about what's going on allows us to identify something that was tacit in the first order goings on, right? And so in particular, just like we used the logical vocabulary of indicative conditionals in the previous example, you might use a logical meta vocabulary of negation to highlight the source of disagreement between A and B, right? So logical meta vocabulary might say something like, well, A and B they shared a commitment to an incompatibility. What they ended up doing with that acknowledgement of that incompatibility was different. What they ended up thinking was the important context on the basis of that incompatibility is different. But once that was highlighted, we were done, right? And again, compare that with the, well, I guess I introduced it as a material, as an indicative conditional, but of course it was a biconditional. Good. And so now what that allows us to identify, hopefully even more clearly, now that I've given you two examples, is the project with respect to descriptive deployment, descriptive vocabulary, right? Because I know what I'm making explicit with the use of negation. I'm making explicit a commitment to an incompatibility. I know what I'm making explicit using a biconditional. The question is, what am I making explicit while using descriptive vocabulary? And this is where I'm going to disappoint you because I'm not actually going to tell you. In part because, something, 2,000 pages, etc. What I will tell you is what I endorse, which is Brandom's idea of what it is that allows us to identify as the role of description talk. And he says it allows for a coordination of social perspectives between interlocutors. It's not unique in doing this, but it's if you add a couple more conditions, it does become unique in doing this. But I will get into that. And it's pretty clear to see how this might be the case, right? We were initially uncoordinated because it looked like we were making incompatible claims. We then understood them as de re claims, right? We were ascribing to the Indian cricket team and the Australian cricket team particular properties. That de re attitude description is dynamically encoded in the deontic scorecard. And the question about how that is, as I said, that's a story for another talk. But what's important from our perspective is what I want to say about how Brandom thinks about the explicitating role of description talk, right? Because after all, we were interested in understanding descriptive deployment. So let me just briefly summarize, because this was a slightly long section. Let me just briefly summarize what I hope to have got on the table What I wanted to suggest was if we detether assertion from description, and nonetheless want to talk about description, we need, as it were, two stories. It's a two-stage process. I'll introduce the idea for deontic scorecard as, I don't like using the word first order because that's almost ambiguous, but you know what I mean. So sort of the object, the commitments in the object vocabulary, that's what I want to say. What the deontic scorecard did was it allowed us to keep track of those in line with accepted conversational norms. And then, importantly, for our purposes, it was a pragmatic meta-vocabulary, right? A pragmatic meta-vocabulary with logical terms in the first instance that allowed us to say what we were doing when we used certain sorts of vocabulary in certain ways, right? And so I gave you the examples of the explicitating roles of conditionals and negations, and then asserted that the project was to try to do the same thing for descriptive vocabulary. None of what I want to argue for in this talk depends on specifically how you do that. So that's the other reason why I'm not talking about specifically how you do that. Beyond noticing, as I said, what the role was, right? The role of the negation was to say something about incompatibility. The role of description is to say something about the coordination of social perspectives. Okay, so we're in the home stretch. We want to talk about the second set of norms, right? Normative notion twice over. And so I want to say a little bit about the norms of vindication. And the reason it's important to say stuff about the norms of vindication is because until this point, like even if you grant me everything about the descriptive deployment stuff being normative, as things stand, I've basically given you something like a syntactic or a grammatical characterization, right? Because if you think about it, words like unicorn or things like singleton Socrates or numeral 5, they also satisfy the Dirac test, at least for some groups of people in some circumstances. So if I'm interested in understanding descriptive deployment as it applies to theoretical claims in my best physics or whatever, I need to do something something in addition to this, right? Because as I've said, as I've left things, electron is in the same bucket as unicorn or singleton Socrates. And if I want semantic realism to be at least a plausible position, I need to be able to distinguish it in such a way that it falls into the same category as table and not into the same category as singleton Socrates for people who are not kid fine, right? I think. Okay. So that's the challenge that I want to address in the last section of the talk, right? How do we characterize what you might call worldly magnitudes or worldly entities without reintroducing this kind of correspondency, inflationary notion of representation that I've been at pains to try to distance myself from in this talk and from much of the last couple of years. And of course, the way that I intend to do that is sort of go to page 34 of the Pragmatist Handbook, and there it says, well, what is it that makes any other kind of talk valuable? How do we, what's the cash value in engaging in particular sorts of talk? Let's just do that for worldly representation or reference or whatever, right? Of course, the hint is going to come from what pragmatists say about truth. What do pragmatists say about truth? It turns out lots and lots and lots and lots of things. But for my purposes, the thing that's important is the idea that there's no such thing as a pragmatist theory of truth, right? At least in the sense of an alternative to something like a correspondence theory of truth or a coherence theory of truth, right? Instead, the pragmatist approach is to say, look, we use is true as a kind of honorific. What are the other things that have similar kinds of honorific capacities? Can't we just talk about them instead, right? In particular, what is it that vindicates our practice, right? What are the practice vindicating effects of engaging in truth talk? Well, let's just talk about those, and let's not worry at all about sort of spooky inflationary correspondence things. At least initially, it might turn out that the best story that we want to tell is one that incorporates reference. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. But if it turns out that that's the case, that has to be the conclusion of our argument and not a premise. Good. So now, what do we learn from what pragmatists tell us about truth with respect to the claims that I want to make about, well, in this case, of representation, or more broadly speaking, evaluation? Well, for the pragmatist, the act of treating a proposition as true is ultimately vindicated or undermined by whether or not the plans formulated on that basis are successful, whether they're good. And I want to suggest that that's exactly what's going on with the descriptive profile ascription, right? The vindication of such a judgment is part of a holistic vindication of our entire practice. And that doesn't come from identifying the sort of worldly truth makers, right? It instead comes from identifying the appropriateness of particular sorts of practices. Let me give you an example, which this is an example from Hugh Price in a slightly different context. But those of you who know Hugh's work will see that this is really, this is very sort of deeply indebted to what he says about I and E representation. And so the idea is something like this. Look, we engage in a bunch of practices, scientific, non-scientific, and the world kind of pushes back in various sorts of ways. And generally speaking, a single impingement of the world on our practices is not going to be enough to confirm or disconfirm a single judgment, right? We've known this at least since Poincaré and Durham, definitely through Quine and Sellars. But sometimes the world is super cooperative and really nice, right? And sometimes we as agents in the world are not idiots and have a modicum of skill with respect to what it is that we take the world to be telling us, right? So with sufficient skill and a sufficiently cooperative world, and I suggest that these are not sort of recalcitrant cases, this is really what happens much of the time, we can use particular sorts of impingements to kind of triangulate the location of the judgment being confirmed or disconfirmed, and then proceed to do what we want to do with it, right? Either dig our heels and sort of further entrench it, or modify it, or drop it, or whatever, right? Now, for simple cases, a descriptive claim will, well, for sufficiently cooperative cases, such as the speedometer, a descriptive claim will be vindicated in the following way. We have some instrument, we have some entity in the world. We read off certain magnitudes from it. All of this is within the speedometer vocabulary, right? There's nothing spooky about this. And what we do is we treat that as we would treat something that co-varies with the magnitude out there in the world. Importantly, we don't need to say anything about characterizing what that worldview magnitude is, because it is enough. We get far enough by being vindicated by treating the outputs of a speedometer reading as the speed of a car, as opposed to the price of onions or something like that. If we don't, then we're a bit unlucky. We might have to do, we might have to go out and do more things in the world and figure out what it is that we need to do. But by and large, to the extent that treating the readings of a speedometer allows me to get to places in time without being pulled over for speeding tickets or things like that, I am justified in treating speed talk as sort of as if we're tracking something in the world. Now, most of the time, it's not going to be this sort of straightforward. There are auxiliary hypotheses, blah, blah, blah. We know all of that. But what I want to suggest is just because that is the case, it doesn't mean that in many situations, for many practical purposes, we cannot, in fact, be vindicated in a descriptive deployment of certain sorts of claims. And that's what I want to suggest is going to give us the second kind, the appropriate normative evaluation, right? And importantly, vindication in this sense is implicated in content conferral, right? It is in part what it is that I'm being told is right about treating a speedometer as varying with the worldly magnitude. That sort of constitutes what it is that I'm talking about when I talk about speed in the first place. Good. So I'm going to end with talking a little bit about how this compares to the sort of the standard story, right? If it's not correspondence, then what vindicates descriptive deployment? And this is where the this is the pragmatist's revenge. It kind of depends on what one's aims are, right? So let me return to an example, slightly self-serving example from earlier. Self-serving because I have another paper on this that I'm happy to say things about. So yeah, supposing one's aims are to use quantum mechanics to ensure that you're not Dutch bookable with respect to bets that you're being given, or more broadly, to just sort of figure out the probabilities of certain things happening as you kind of walk through the world, right? Quantum mechanics is very good at telling you things like that. If that's the goal, then you might say, okay, well, under what circumstances am I vindicated in treating the quantum state as if it's descriptive? And the answer is, in situations X, Y, Z, read Menon 2025. What I want to suggest is that's not the only sort of way that we can talk about aims in a useful and important way, right? So the other example that I gave you earlier was the sort of theory construction heuristic, so dark matter versus modified gravity. You might think something like, look, my goal, I mean, the sort of broad goal is ultimately, you know, prediction, description, whatever. But my sort of much more proximate goal, qua cosmologist, is to come up with a good, consistent, and plausible theory that might stand a chance of explaining certain recalcitrant sorts of observations. A realist about matter, for example, might say something like, look, the matter of the standard model doesn't exhaust all of the kind of matter that there is. There is this other kind of thing about which I'm as much a realist, as much a descriptivist as I ought to be about standard model matter. Now, how much of a descriptivist I am about that, we leave that aside for a second. And on the basis of doing that, I will now construct a theory in which I descriptively deploy claims about matter, and then think of that matter as having certain sorts of effects on the world that render themselves through various kinds of cosmological observations. Contrast that with an anti-realist about matter, or at least about dark matter, who will say, no, that same effect is not down to the effects of something that I'm treating as descriptive, not down to the effects of something that's picked out by vocabulary that I'm treating as descriptively deployed, but instead something else. And what's going on over here is there's going to be a disagreement over the propriety, according to different sets of norms, of descriptive deployments in terms of the sort of overall goal of, as it were, coming up with better science. And what I want to suggest is that's fine too. It's not an anything goes with respect to these sorts of constraining norms, but it's also not, you shouldn't think of these norms as constrained entirely in the sorts of ways that the descriptivist might want you to think, and sort of standard presentation of scientific realism might lead you to think. As a result, and this is coming back to what I said right at the beginning, I think realism and anti-realism both represent different proposals for how to improve our situation, right? They're both associated with a kind of progressive aspect. And the reason that I bring this up is there's a recent book by Hassett Chan in which he kind of co-opts realism to this sort of epistemic progressive ideal, right? And he says, look, there's a particular sort of reconceptualization of realism that I think we should all engage in, on which to be a realist is just to endorse particular sorts of sort of knowledge accumulation norms. And I want to suggest that that's not true. I think we should all endorse scientific knowledge accumulation norms, but those norms are not norms of realism, right? They don't come from the same place as the interest in understanding descriptive deployment. And what I want to suggest is this gives us a much better story about what it is that leads us to want to be realists or anti-realists in the first place, in a way that doesn't render the anti-realist, in some sense, deficient. That's basically it. So I think what I'll do, I'm just going to keep this up because I don't want to go through everything again. It might be helpful to just have this up during the Q&A session. Thank you very much for your time.
Right? There's plenty of time for questions.
Or did you ever end up scheduling